Hey everyone, welcome to my Feixiao guide. I will be going over her build obviously, which will include relics like clones and so on, her trace priority, Eidolons if you're pulling for them, how to actually play her, and finally some themes that you can use. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you want to see her whole kit in detail, I have already reviewed her kit and will usually do this kind of videos a week or more before her release, and so you can look out for that next time. But Feixiao's kit is actually extremely simple, but at the same time quite overloaded. She basically gets a follow-up attack whenever you use your skill, and when your ally attacks. So in each turn, she gets 1 attack and 2 follow-ups because it's limited to 1 each turn. The majority of the damage will come from her ultimate, 2 attacks will give you 1 stack, and you need 6 stacks in total. She gives herself a lot of self buffs, and she has a pretty good multiplier, which is why her ultimate does so much damage. Another very important thing to consider is that her ultimate is considered as follow-up damage, and this will allow greater flexibility when building her. And so when it comes to relic sets, it is incredibly easy to choose. We are going for Wind Soaring Valorous and Duran Dynasty. Even though her ultimate is considered follow-up damage, it does not seem to work with Enid Sasoto just like it does not for Yunli. You will still only get a 15% damage buff. This is why Duran Dynasty is much better, because you can get a 25% follow-up buff and more. Wind Soaring is pretty obvious because Feixiao uses so many follow-ups and will boost her ultimate damage, which again is the majority of her damage. Relic stats are very easy as well. For main stats you want crit rate or damage depending on which you need more of, speed boots, wind damage up, and attack percentage rope. Her self buffs are quite well spread out, so she doesn't go for an attack percentage up like Acheron, because Acheron is able to give herself a lot of damage percentage and no attack percentage buffs. Feixiao gets both attack percentage and damage percentage, hence you can just spread her damage out as usual. When it comes to substats, it's pretty much the same as main stats. Feixiao wants crit, attack, and speed, and that's what you'll be aiming for. Speed is naturally quite important because you want to stack her ultimate as fast as possible, but it's not that important to the point where you would try to get 160 or 170 speed. Most of her stack regeneration should actually come from your teammates, and so her speed will only matter a lot more if you're running hyper carry teams like with Eve or Bronya or Sparkle. Hence, usually 140 or even 150 speed is probably fine, but I would still recommend around 150 speed. Thankfully, she has relatively high base speed, so running speed boots makes it quite easy to hit the goal, and you might find you even have 160 plus speed, which is completely fine. With 9 speed from substats, my theoretical Feixiao already has 146 speed for your reference. For attack, it's quite easy to hit 3000 attack, and so I would recommend roughly 2700 and above. Next we have light cones. Although her signature light cone is the best, Feixiao actually has quite a few good alternatives. Unfortunately, most of these better choices are actually other 5-star light cones, Worrisome Blissful and Baptism of Pure Thought. Dr. Risho's light cone being the second best choice. However, for it to be the second best, it requires debuffs to be applied. And Feixiao will be kind of played like Dr. Risho himself, where she will most likely be alternating between 2 targets. The thing with the follow-up team is that not many of them have multiple debuffs. This is a lot easier with E1 S1 Topaz, but without that you might struggle to get the extra 24% crit damage. If you're somehow able to apply multiple debuffs to multiple enemies, this light cone is actually very close to being as good as her signature. In reality, and with the tools we have right now, this can be slightly more difficult unless you run a team with maybe Pela and Gallagher, and hence will not be as close to her signature in practice. Worrisome Blissful is a very strong light cone as it gives follow-up damage boost, crit rate, and can also increase your team's crit damage to the enemy with the tame state. It might just be a bit awkward because if you have this light cone, you might already have to pass. Next we have Swordplay S5. It is pretty decent and actually does quite competitive damage if you are able to maintain 5 stacks, which is relatively easy because Feixiao is able to get 5 stacks in a single turn. The problem is, Feixiao might not always hit the same target with her follow-ups, especially in Memory of Chaos, which means your uptime will be much lower than 100%. Even then, it is still a pretty good choice due to how much damage percentage you can get. Finally, we have Cruising in the Stellar Sea and in the Night. Cruising in the Stellar Sea I averaged out to be her worst light cone out of the above light cones. This light cone is much stronger against waves with some weaker enemies because you are able to get the 40% attack boost. If you are dealing with elites or bosses, this light cone will get much worse. The Night is a decent light cone, but The skill and basic attack damage boost is kinda useless, but you do get a decent amount of crit damage from this light cone. However, it is not enough for this to be competitive with the other limited 5-star light cones. From here, other decent alternatives are Yensing's 5-star light cone, River Flows in Spring, but this will require a shielder, Only Silence Remains, and Final Victor. When it comes to trace priority, literally every single one of the bonus abilities are important, so get all of them. And for stats, get crit and attack percentage first, but there is one node of defense you have to get to unlock more crit and attack, so you should probably get that as well. I do not recommend leveling her basic attack at all, as you want to use the skill as much as you can. So you will go something like her ultimate and talent first, her skill, and then you can level her basic attack if you want to. If you are planning to pull more copies or perhaps in the future, we will now be going over her Eidolons. E1 increases her ultimate damage by 10% when launching both Thunder Blitz or War Axe Skyward, stacking up to 5 times. It is important to note that this is not a normal damage boost, but actually a separate multiplier. And if you have been watching my videos, by now you should know that a separate multiplier is always much better, and that is why it is only a 50% increase in total. I found this to give you about a 28 to 30% increase in your total damage, and so it's a pretty decent Eidolon. E2 is actually arguably her strongest Eidolon, and basically upgrades your follow-up attacks from 0.5 stacks to giving you 1 stack. So basically doubling your stack regeneration for 6 follow-up attacks. This is strong because it will regenerate her ultimate much faster, and I found can give you around a 65% increase in damage as compared to E0, higher if you have a better invested team. Unfortunately, it is not as crazy as Acheron's E2 or Feixiao's E2 because this will only apply to follow-up attacks. And also, running units like Mosaic or Topaz becomes much better than Hunt March at E2 because Hunt March only does 1 follow-up each turn. E4 increases her toughness reduction from her follow-up attack by 100% and also increases her speed by 8% when launching her follow-up attack. This is extremely bad because Feixiao doesn't really run Super Break, and hence toughness reduction is not the best, and the extra speed is quite small and will give you about 10 flat speed. E6 is pretty good as well, but again, not as crazy as other E6 we have in the game. It increases her all-type rest pen for ultimate damage by 20%, and her follow-up attack is now considered ultimate damage, and again also increases the multiplier by 140%, which means her follow-up is now a 250% multiplier. This actually gives Feixiao more damage outside of her ultimate and gives her only a slight boost to her ultimate, which is the bulk of the damage. And hence, I found this to be about a 120% increase over E0, which is decent, but characters like Acheron can increase her damage by twice at E2 already. Hence, her Eidolons aren't actually very impressive, perhaps because Hoyoverse thinks her E0 is already very strong, which I guess is great for free-to-play players, but for most people who want to invest more, I highly recommend stopping at E2 or just not pulling extra copies at all. If you have to decide between E1 and S1, E1 will give you more value if you are able to use a light cone like Worrisome Blissful and Baptism of Pure Thought, both of which are limited 5-star light cones. However, if you are unable to do so, understandably so, S1 will give you better value. Playing Feixiao is extremely straightforward. Use her skill every turn and then use her ultimate when you need to, for example during Robin's ultimate. They removed a lot of skill expression from a kit during the beta because you could previously use 6 to 12 stacks, so it could be like 8 stacks or 9 stacks and so on, but now you can only use 6 stacks at all times, so it's a lot more straightforward. Her ultimate looks a little bit more complicated at first glance because of both Thunder Blitz and War Axe Skyward, but I'm pretty sure on auto they will automatically choose the better one for you, so you don't have to worry about that. Like I said previously, in Memory of Chaos they will most likely have 2 to 3 enemies most of the time, and hence you would probably be focusing on one enemy with your skill and follow-up attack, and then use her ultimate on the other enemy who still has high HP. Feixiao's teams, while slightly restrictive, is still relatively simple, and we have access to quite a lot of characters upon her release. You would normally run 1 sustain, 1 support, 1 sub DPS, and then Feixiao. However, you can also run 1 sustain, 2 supports, and Feixiao, but this is slightly more niche since Mosaic and Hunt March are quite free-to-play friendly alternatives. For the sustain slot, Aventurine, Lingsha, and Gallagher are all great choices, with Aventurine being the best choice because of his frequent follow-up attacks. Lingsha has a lower frequency when it comes to follow-ups, but she can apply AoE debuffs, which can be quite useful for Dr. Ratio's Light Cone, and also has an AoE cleanse. Gallagher has an action advance, and with multiplication can get even more advanced, and hence has a decent frequency of attacks even if he doesn't have follow-ups. For the support slot, I've already mentioned this in my previous Feixiao video, but Robin is the absolute best. From then, it depends on your team and what you want to run. If you want to focus on your sub DPS damage as well, you should be looking at Run Mei, Jiaoqiu, or Pela. If you want a more hypercarry team, Bronya and Sparkle are very strong choices. Finally, for the sub DPS slots, we have a lot of options actually. The best is going to be Topaz. Her 50% vulnerability and her frequency of follow-ups is absolutely insane. From here, you can run Hunt March, Mose, Yunli, Clara, or even E1 Jade. As long as they can attack relatively quickly, they are all pretty good choices. The reason why people focus more on Hunt, March, Mose, and Topaz is because they can benefit Feixiao in ways other than stacking her ultimate. However, Yunli and Clara can actually give you a lot of stacks very quickly depending on the enemy you are facing. However, you would then want a team-wide support like Jiaoqiu, Pela, Runmei, or Robin, because otherwise they would not do a lot of damage by themselves. E4 Bronya is also a thing a lot of people have been hyping up, and it can be pretty good in certain scenarios. However, you need the enemy to have wind weakness, and you need somebody to use their basic attack. This can be slightly inconvenient in some cases, but against enemies with no wind weakness, this will be basically useless. In dual DPS teams, you can actually lose quite a lot of damage for your sub DPS by running Bronya, which is why it's a slightly more niche interaction. That's pretty much it for this Feixiao guide. Remember to leave a like, and as always, thanks for watching.